They say empires rise and fall. But what if I told you there was one African kingdom so fierce, so unbreakable, that European colonizers feared it more than they feared war itself? And its deadliest soldiers were women. This isn't fantasy, it's history, and you're not ready for how real it gets. This is the story of the Dahomey Amazons, the all-female warrior army that took on the world's strongest colonial powers and refused to back down. Once you hear how they lived, how they trained, and how they fought, you'll never see African history the same way again. So here's the deal. Forget what you learned in school, because this story has been buried, hidden, ignored, and yet it's more brutal, more inspiring, and more mind-blowing than most ancient war movies combined. Let's go back, way back, West Africa, 1600s. At the time, Europe was clawing its way across the globe, hungry for land, gold, and control. In Africa, empires were rising and falling fast. But in a stretch of land that's now known as Benin, a new power was forming, the Kingdom of Dahomey. This wasn't some village with grass huts and spears, like those old colonial cartoons tried to show. No, this was a real, structured kingdom with kings, councils, taxes, armies, and strategy. And at the heart of this kingdom was a shockwave nobody saw coming, the Agoji. That's what they were really called. Agoji, the Dahomey Amazons? That was a name slapped on them by the French later. Because the only way Europeans could understand this fierce all-female army was to compare them to the mythical warriors of Greece. But here's the thing. These warriors weren't myths. They were real, and their blades were sharper than any story. Now, how did this all start? Well, there are a few theories. Some historians say King Hugbaja, who ruled around the mid-1600s, started forming a bodyguard unit made up of women, loyal, disciplined, and deadly. Others say the Agoji began as elephant hunters. Think about that for a second. Taking down massive elephants with spears and traps. That takes guts, precision, and teamwork. Whichever story you believe, what we do know is this. By the time King Gizo took the throne in the early 1800s, the Agoji weren't just some side squad. They were the backbone of the Dahomey military, and they were expanding fast. Gizo wasn't playing around. He saw the writing on the wall. Colonial powers were creeping in from all sides, especially the French. So he did something radical. He took his kingdom's strongest, fiercest women and turned them into an elite force. These weren't women forced into battle. Many of them joined voluntarily. Some were recruited young, as early as 8 or 9, from families who saw military service as the highest honor. Others were taken in from conquered villages and trained as a way to gain power and status. But once you were in for life. No husbands, no kids, no outside ties. The palace became your family. The king became your only loyalty. Now let's talk training. Because this wasn't some light drill session. The Agoji trained harder than most men. Every single day, they practiced hand-to-hand combat, sharpened their blade skills, and ran grueling obstacle courses. They learned to climb thorny walls barefoot, to kill without hesitation, and to endure pain without flinching. One French officer who witnessed them said their drills were savage beyond belief. They'd be woken in the dead of night to simulate surprise attacks. They'd sleep in trees, eat what they hunted, practice decapitation, yes, real decapitation, on prisoners of war. They were taught to keep moving even if wounded. If they lost their weapon, use their hands. If they lost a hand, use their teeth. They were taught one thing: you do not stop fighting until you're dead. They were also taught silence, discipline, complete unity. There's one story, maybe myth, maybe real, where a new recruit is told to kill a bound prisoner as a test of loyalty. She hesitates. The commander doesn't yell, doesn't scream. She just quietly steps forward and slits the prisoner's throat herself. Then she turns to the recruit and says, "You don't belong here." That's the level we're talking about. And when it came to war, the Agoji weren't just shock troops, they were the first wave. Picture this. A line of women, hundreds deep, their heads shaved, their uniforms deep blue or crimson, walking barefoot across scorching earth. Their rifles are slung over their backs, machetes in their hands. No fear in their eyes, When they attacked, they didn't sneak in quietly. They announced their arrival with war cries that echoed for miles. They charged fast, loud, merciless, like a wall of thunder. Enemies would drop their weapons before the fight even started. But here's the thing, the Agoji weren't fighting random tribal skirmishes. They were up against colonial troops, French soldiers, armed with the latest guns, artillery, battle tactics trained in European academies. And yet, the French were terrified of them. In 1890, the First Franco-Dahomeyan War broke out. The French had a classic playbook: intimidate, divide, conquer. It had worked elsewhere. Why not here? Big mistake. At the Battle of Cotonou, the Agoji stormed French positions with such intensity that French officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their reports described women rushing bayonets without hesitation, refusing to scream even when shot. One French sergeant wrote, "They fought like lions, but with the precision of machines." The French won some battles. Sure, they had better tech, but they couldn't break Dahomey's will. So they returned 2 years later, this time ready for a real war. Now, this is where things get bloody. The Second Franco-Dahomeyan War was brutal. France came with more soldiers, machine guns, and cannons. But Dahomey met them with something Europe couldn't understand: an army driven by soul, by sacrifice, and by absolute loyalty. The Agoji staged night raids, burned supply camps, and ambushed patrols. They used their knowledge of the land like a blade, and they fought to the death. But here's where it gets real. The French, embarrassed by their struggles, started spreading lies. They painted the Agoji as barbaric, savage, inhuman, because the idea of African women beating trained European soldiers, that was just too much. They didn't want Europe to know the truth, that they were losing ground to women. Eventually, though, guns speak louder than courage. The French overwhelmed Dahomey's capital in 1892. It wasn't a clean victory. It was a massacre. But even as the kingdom fell, the legend of the Agoji only grew stronger. One final scene sticks out from the French records. As the French entered Dahomey, the Dahomey capital, they found an Agoji warrior bleeding from a gunshot wound. Alone, surrounded, she stood up, screamed the name of her ancestors, and charged. She was cut down instantly, but the memory of that moment burned into the minds of every soldier who saw it. That was the spirit of the Agoji. And even though Dahomey lost the war, they won something bigger: legacy. Europe thought they could erase them, rewrite the story, turn them into a footnote. But you can't bury the truth forever. And now, thanks to hidden diaries, military archives, and oral history passed down through generations, the truth is coming out. What makes this story even crazier? This was all happening at a time when most European women couldn't even vote, couldn't own land, were told to stay in the kitchen. Meanwhile, in West Africa, there was an empire built on the strength of warrior women who'd make Spartans sweat. So ask yourself, why wasn't this in your textbook? Because if young girls knew this history, if boys did too, the whole idea of who's strong or powerful might have looked very different. And let's not forget the name behind the force: King Gizo. This man wasn't some puppet. He reformed the entire kingdom to make the Agoji elite. He cut deals with European traders, balanced diplomacy and bloodshed. And yeah, he was complicated. More on that in the next part. But one thing is certain: without Gizo, the Agoji might have never become what they did. By the time Gizo died, the Dahomey Amazons were legendary. Envoys from Europe visited Dahomey just to witness their drills. Paintings were made. Stories were told in hushed voices. Some European officers tried to dismiss them, calling them unfeminine or wild. But privately, they admitted they'd never seen anything like it, and they never would again. So, now you know how the Dahomey Amazons fought like legends. But there's a deeper layer to this story, the one history books often skip. Because behind every unstoppable army is a ruler, and behind the Agoji was one of the most complex, cunning, and controversial kings in African history: King Gizo. Let's talk about him. And trust me, this part of the story, it gets messy. King Gizo ruled Dahomey from 1818 to 1859, over 40 years on the throne. And during that time, he didn't just sit back and wear a crown. He transformed the kingdom from a regional power into a feared empire. But how did he do it? 2 words: reform and ruthlessness. Before Gizo, Dahomey was already powerful but fractured. Gizo cleaned house. He centralized power, slashed away rival clans, and built a military machine. He made the kingdom more disciplined, more structured, and way more lethal. And at the heart of that machine, the Agoji. Gizo didn't just expand the female army. He elevated them. He gave them better weapons, more authority. They trained alongside male warriors, but were often given the most dangerous missions. Not because they were expendable, but because they were trusted, respected, in some cases, feared even by their own people. Now here's the part that might make you do a double take. The Agoji were sworn to celibacy, right? No husbands, no children. But Gizo, he was the exception. The king had hundreds of wives, and many of them were former Agoji warriors. That's right. Some Agoji, after years of service, were promoted to royal wives. It was seen as a mark of honor. Loyalty, strange, complicated, even problematic through a modern lens. But this was the world they lived in. Power was everything, and the king was the sun. But Gizo wasn't just managing warriors. He was playing a dangerous game with Europe. See, by the early 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade was in full swing. European ships would arrive at West African ports, looking to buy slaves in exchange for guns, cloth, and alcohol. And many African kingdoms, Dahomey included, became part of that brutal system. Now pause. Let's be real here. This is the part that stings. Yes, Dahomey under Gizo captured and sold other Africans into slavery. The Agoji participated in these raids. They were the ones who stormed enemy villages, seized captives, and brought them back for sale or sacrifice. It's dark, but it's true. We can't paint Dahomey as just heroes. They were also players in a global horror show. But here's what makes it complicated. Gizo was under insane pressure. On one hand, Britain was pushing hard to end the slave trade. They sent diplomats, threats, and even warships to block slave routes. On the other hand, slave trading was one of the only ways Dahomey could stay economically powerful. Refusing it meant losing influence, maybe even survival. Gizo was stuck. In 1852, under heavy British pressure, he agreed publicly to stop the slave trade. But behind the scenes, kept going. Quietly, secretly, the king played both sides like a master chess player. He needed money, guns, European tech. So he kept the trade alive, but he diversified. Dahomey began expanding into palm oil production, taxing traders, and raiding rival kingdoms for wealth. The Agoji became more than warriors. They were enforcers, tax collectors, guards, symbols of fear and pride rolled into one. But they were also tools in a brutal system. Imagine this. A young Agoji recruit, maybe 15 years old, standing beside her sisters as they return from a raid. Dozens of prisoners are chained. Some will be sold. Some will be sacrificed at the annual customs ceremony. A mix of spiritual ritual and political message. And she's told, this is your duty. This is how we stay strong. Now fast forward 10 years. She's a commander, respected, unmatched in battle, feared by enemies. And the same system she came up in, still grinding forward. That's the world King Gizo built. Ruthless, brilliant, unforgiving. But there was another side to him too. He was a reformer. Gizo improved agriculture, fortified trade routes, and commissioned artists to document his reign. He brought scholars and strategists into court. He valued intellect as much as brute strength. And he saw the Agoji not just as soldiers, but as protectors of Dahomey's legacy. He believed women could embody honor, sacrifice, and discipline just like men. Maybe even more so. In fact, women in Dahomey weren't limited to the battlefield. They served in the royal court. They were judges, administrators, and diplomats. Not everywhere, of course. But the fact that they had any role at all in power, that was rare, especially for the 1800s. Under Guizot, the Dahomey Amazons became global legends. European explorers and envoys came back with wild stories. One British captain described the Agoge as fierce as tigers. Noting that they walked with such purpose, even male soldiers gave them space. French military reports from the 1850s mention encountering Agoge patrols that were more disciplined than most local militias. And remember, these were reports coming from colonizers, people who had every reason to downplay African strength. They couldn't ignore the Agoge. Guizot knew this, and he used it to his advantage. He invited foreign guests to watch the Agoge drill. Picture this: European officers sitting in awe as hundreds of women storm a mock fortress, complete with war cries, fake explosions, and swordplay. It wasn't just theater. It was a message. Mess with Dahomey, and this is what you'll face. But even Guizot couldn't hold back the tide forever. He died in 1859. His son, Glil, took over, but the world was changing fast. The slave trade was collapsing. Colonial interests were intensifying, and Dahomey's economic power began to wobble. The French were circling like sharks, and the Agoge, they kept training, kept fighting. But the world they were built to defend was getting squeezed tighter and tighter. Still, they didn't stop. They raided rival kingdoms, defended trade routes, patrolled the borders, and they kept doing it with the same fire that Guizot had lit decades earlier. You see, the Agoge weren't just fighting to protect a kingdom. They were fighting to prove something deeper. That strength, true, soul-deep strength, isn't about gender or status or birthright. It's about commitment, sacrifice, will. They didn't want pity. They wanted victory. Even as the French pushed in with better weapons and bigger armies, the Agoge refused to bow. By the late 1800s, the world around Dahomey was falling apart. The European colonizers weren't just sending diplomats anymore. They were sending soldiers, steamships, guns, entire armies. The French had their eyes locked on the coastline of West Africa, and the kingdom of Dahomey was right in their crosshairs. But even with war looming, even with superior weapons pointed at their borders, the Agoge didn't blink. They prepared. And what came next was the final chapter in one of history's most overlooked, blood-soaked showdowns. The year is 1890. France had spent decades chipping away at the African coast. Treaties here, land grabs there. They were experts at divide and conquer. They'd weakened other African kingdoms by playing allies against each other. And now Dahomey was next. But the French miscalculated one thing. They assumed Dahomey would fold like the rest. Instead, they got dragged into a war they never wanted to fight. It all started when King Bihanzin, Guizot's grandson, took the throne. Unlike his father, Glil, who was more cautious with the French, Bihanzin was ready to throw punches. He banned European traders from setting up shop on his terms. He taxed French goods. He rearmed his military. And the Agoge, he doubled their size. Bihanzin didn't want compromise. He wanted control. And the French didn't like that. So, France claimed Dahomey had violated some obscure treaty from earlier negotiations. Basically a weak excuse to justify war. And they sent troops to Cotonou, one of the key port cities. Big mistake. Bihanzin responded by unleashing the full fury of the Dahomey army, led by none other than the Agoge. What followed was the First Franco-Dahomeyan War, and if you think European powers always steamrolled African resistance, think again. The Agoge charged French positions with spears, rifles, and unmatched coordination. They moved like shadows, fast, brutal, precise. Even French officers admitted in their reports that they had underestimated the enemy, especially the women. In one infamous skirmish, French soldiers opened fire expecting the enemy to scatter. Instead, the Agoge kept coming. Some were shot down instantly, but the rest closed the gap and turned it into hand-to-hand combat. The French weren't used to this. They were used to tribes who ran. But the Agoge, they advanced until the last one fell. It shocked the French. It rattled their troops. But it didn't stop their advance. The French had one thing Dahomey didn't: machine guns. And this was the beginning of the end. But it wasn't the end yet. After a year of fighting, France offered a peace deal. Translation: Surrender and we'll let you keep breathing. Behanzin refused. And that's when the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War began, the final, brutal act of the Dahomey resistance. The French came back with full force in 1892. Thousands of infantry, Gatling guns, artillery, support from other African soldiers who had been conscripted or bribed into serving France. And standing in their way, the Agoji. By now, their numbers had shrunk. Years of battle had taken their toll. Many were older, wounded, exhausted, but they still fought. They fought in forests, ambushing supply routes. They fought in towns, laying traps and launching night raids. They fought in open fields, even when outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded. There's one story that's almost too powerful to believe, but it's recorded in multiple French journals. A small band of Agoji warriors, no more than a dozen, held off a French platoon for hours near a town called Dogba. They ran out of ammunition, then used machetes. They were the last line between the French and the royal palace. When it was over, every single Agoji was dead. But so were nearly half the French soldiers. That's the kind of resistance they gave. But even the fiercest warrior can't stop bullets forever. Eventually, the French reached Dahomey's capital. Behanzin ordered it burned to the ground before they arrived. If they wanted the kingdom, they'd have to take it in ashes. And just like that, Dahomey fell. The kingdom was absorbed into French West Africa, colonized, ruled by outsiders. But what about the Agoji? Some were killed in battle. Others were captured and forced into labor. A few scattered, vanishing into nearby villages and forests. Their uniforms burned. Their ranks dissolved. But the memory of what they had done, what they stood for, never left. Even the French couldn't deny their bravery. Officers wrote about them with a mix of fear, admiration, and disbelief. One captain said, "These women fought like demons. We did not face soldiers, we faced spirits." That's the legacy they left. But here's what most people don't know. Even after Dahomey fell, the Agoji spirit didn't die. Some surviving warriors joined local rebellions. Others became folk heroes, passed down in whispered stories around fire pits. Mothers told their daughters about the women who didn't flinch when the cannons roared. In some parts of Benin today, there are still elders who claim descent from the Agoji. And their pride? Unshakable. Because this wasn't just a military unit. It was a symbol that said, "We will not be defined by what others expect. We will fight, and we will make history, even if the world tries to erase it." And for more than 200 years, that's exactly what the Agoji did. So let's be honest here. Why didn't you hear this story sooner? Because colonial history didn't want you to. Europe didn't want its citizens to know that women from an African kingdom fought better than many of their trained male soldiers. That an empire run by black royalty could build an elite female army centuries before women were even allowed to vote in Europe or America. It didn't fit the narrative, so it got buried. But history has a funny way of surviving, especially stories that matter. In recent years, researchers and historians have pieced together what the French tried to erase. Diaries, military records, oral accounts passed down for generations. And finally, slowly, the world is starting to listen. Hollywood touched on the Agoji with the movie The Woman King. And while the film took some liberties, it opened the door. It made people ask questions. It sparked curiosity. But there's still so much more to learn, and so much more truth to tell. So now you've seen how the Dahomey Amazons fought wars, resisted empires, and left colonizers shaking in their boots. But what was life like inside their world? What really happened behind the palace walls, when the battles were over and the smoke cleared? Because here's the truth. The battlefield was only one part of being a Agoji. To become one of these elite warriors, you didn't just need strength. You needed discipline, sacrifice, and complete transformation, body and mind. Let's go inside their world. It all started with selection. Some girls joined willingly. Others were sent by their families, especially if the family wanted to gain favor with the king. Some were taken as tribute from rival villages, raised inside the palace, and molded into warriors. But once you were chosen, there was no going back. Joining the Agoge wasn't just like signing up for the military. It was more like dying to your old self and being reborn into something completely new. First, your hair was shaved. You were given a uniform, usually indigo blue or deep crimson, with symbols of loyalty sewn into the fabric. Then came the vow, absolute loyalty to the king, the palace, and your sisters in arms. No marriage, no children, no attachments to the outside world. Your identity became the uniform. Your purpose became the mission. Your life became the kingdom. Training began immediately, and it was brutal. We're not talking push-ups and sword drills. The Agoge went through psychological warfare. They were taught to suppress fear, to suppress pain, to obey orders instantly and without question. One famous training ritual involved climbing thorn-covered walls barefoot, while being whipped from behind. If you cried, you failed. If you stopped, you were dismissed. Another drill involved sneaking through forests at night with no light, hunting wild animals, and bringing back their heads. Alone, silent, fast. They were also taught battlefield medicine, how to stop bleeding, treat arrow wounds, even set broken bones. Not because they were medics, but because they couldn't rely on anyone else. One report from a European missionary describes a young Agoge slicing open her own arm in front of her squad, just to prove she could bleed and not flinch. Pain wasn't something to avoid. Pain was a badge. They also practiced execution. Yeah, this part's rough, but it's real. Execution drills were used to prepare them for killing without hesitation. Captured prisoners, often from enemy tribes or rival groups, were used in these practices. Some were beheaded with ceremonial swords. Others were used in public rituals to show the might of Dahomey. To outsiders, it looked barbaric. But to the Agoge, it was a necessary rite of passage. A test of willpower, a message to their enemies. And it worked. Even their own people feared crossing an Agoge warrior. There were stories of market thieves begging to be punished by any guard except the women in uniform. But there was another side to life in the palace too, one most people never talk about: sisterhood. You see, while the world outside saw them as cold-blooded killers, inside the palace the Agoge formed deep, unbreakable bonds. They ate together, slept in shared quarters, trained shoulder to shoulder. They looked out for each other. If one was injured, the others carried her gear. If one was punished, they all shared the blame. Loyalty wasn't just to the king, it was to each other. And they had rituals for that, too. Before every mission, they'd gather in a sacred courtyard and chant songs of war. Not loud, violent songs, but calm, eerie ones, meant to summon focus, to call upon the spirits of ancestors, to remind each warrior that they were part of something ancient and powerful. They also honored their fallen. After battle, if a sister had died, the Agoge would hold silent rituals, bury her with her blade, carve her name into ceremonial trees, and promise to carry her spirit into the next fight. In their world, death wasn't the end, it was a promotion. But let's not romanticize this too much. Life inside the Agoge wasn't easy. There were strict punishments for disobedience, from public beatings to exile. Some commanders were harsher than others. Some palace officials used their power to exploit newer recruits. And even though they held great status, the Agoge still answered to the king. He was the sun, and everything in the kingdom revolved around him. But make no mistake, these women weren't puppets. Some rose to high command. Some led entire battalions. And a few, especially the older veterans, were so respected that even male generals asked them for advice before battle. Now here's something wild: their spiritual life. The Agoge weren't just warriors of the flesh. They believed in being warriors of the spirit. They prayed to the gods of iron and war. They carried amulets, often carved from bones or etched with ancestral names. They performed purification rituals before battles, rubbing their skin with chalk, dancing around fire, sometimes fasting for days. Some even believed that dying in battle meant becoming an immortal protector of Dahomey. There's a legend, still told today, that one Agoge warrior who died defending the palace turned into a lioness and now guards the ruins of Abumi. Hunters swear they've seen her pacing in the trees, eyes glowing like coals. Believe it or not, that's how deep the lore goes. And it didn't stop there. The Agoge also held influence in court. When the king made big decisions, war, diplomacy, trade, he'd often consult his female advisors. Many of them were former commanders. Some were assigned to monitor male officials, report disloyalty, and keep the system in check. In a strange twist, these warrior women weren't just fighters. They were spies, judges, leaders. Think about how rare that was in the 1800s. In most of the world, Europe included, women weren't allowed to vote, speak in public council, or hold military titles. Meanwhile, in Dahomey, a teenage girl could rise through the ranks and command an army. That's not just unusual, that's revolutionary. But even revolutions come at a cost. Many Agoge never saw old age. Most died in battle. Some were executed if they were suspected of betrayal. Others disappeared into the villages after Dahomey fell, hiding their past to avoid colonial punishment. But their legacy, it never vanished. Today, in modern-day Benin, some of the descendants of the Agoge still live. Some are proud, some are quiet about it, but the stories survive. And recently, a few elders, women in their 90s, came forward to share what had been passed down to them. Not war stories, not bloodshed, but memories of laughter in the barracks, of songs sung before dawn, of hands held after battle, of promises whispered over the graves of fallen sisters. Because for all their violence, the Agoge weren't just built to kill. They were built to belong, to something bigger, something sacred, something worth dying for. And maybe that's why their story still echoes, even after colonizers tried to bury it, even after Hollywood tried to glamorize it, even after textbooks ignored it. Because deep down, we all recognize real power when we see it. And the Dahomey Amazons? They weren't just warriors. They were a reminder that strength has no gender, that courage needs no permission, and that sometimes the fiercest fighters in history don't look the way you expect. You'd think a story this intense, this legendary, would be on every classroom wall, right? Wrong. For over a century, the world barely spoke of the Dahomey Amazons. Not because they weren't important, but because they didn't fit the narrative. Europe had colonized half the planet. They weren't exactly eager to admit they'd once been pushed back, repeatedly, by a kingdom led in part by warrior women. But legends don't stay buried forever, because over the years, piece by piece, the story of the Agoge has clawed its way back into the spotlight. And now, their legacy is echoing louder than ever. Let's talk about how. Let's start with something big, the modern military. Believe it or not, some African military units today trace parts of their tradition back to the Agoge, not through structure, but through spirit. Take Benin, for example, the modern country where the kingdom of Dahomey once stood. Some of the national celebrations, uniforms, and cultural references still carry the symbolism of those warrior women. They're no longer active combatants, of course, but their memory is baked into national pride. Young girls grow up hearing their stories. Statues stand in their honor. Museums in Benin preserve their weapons, their uniforms, even their chants. Because the Agoge weren't just warriors, they were role models. The idea that women can lead, fight, and protect wasn't a modern invention. It had already been proven over and over on African soil. Then there's the global pop culture impact. In 2018, when Marvel released Black Panther, the world met the Dora Milaje, the elite all-female guard that protects the king of Wakanda. Strong, fast, fearless. Sound familiar? The creators of Black Panther openly said the Dora Milaje were inspired by the Dahomey Amazons. That movie didn't just break box office records. It reshaped the way Hollywood and audiences around the world looked at African power, and at female power, too. Suddenly, the idea of women in armor wasn't fantasy. It had roots, real roots, in Dahomey, and that impact, it rippled out fast. Soon after Black Panther, Hollywood turned its full attention to the real-life story behind the inspiration. That's when The Woman King hit the big screen, starring Viola Davis. Now, look, the movie took dramatic liberties. It changed some timelines. It blurred some facts. But it did one thing very, very right. It made the world look. Suddenly, Millions of people were Googling Dahomey Amazons. Historians were invited on podcasts. Articles exploded across the internet. Teachers started including them in lesson plans. The conversation had finally begun. But this isn't just about representation on screen. It's about correction. Because for too long, African history has been flattened, reduced to slavery, colonization, and struggle. The Agoge flipped that on its head. They weren't enslaved. They weren't passive. They weren't begging for help. They were the storm. And that matters, especially today. Because now we live in a world where women are still fighting to be taken seriously in leadership, in politics, in the military, even in history itself. And for Black women especially, that fight's even steeper. That's why stories like this hit so hard. The Dahomey Amazons weren't waiting to be saved. They were the saviors. They protected their people. They made their enemies tremble. And they didn't need a crown, a husband, or a European title to define their worth. They built their legacy, sword by sword, mile by mile, until the world had no choice but to remember them. And their spirit? It's everywhere now. You see it in women's defense groups training in Africa and South America. You see it in martial arts schools using the Agoge as examples of strategy and discipline. You see it in protest movements, where women link arms and say, "We protect our own." That's the real legacy. Not just what they did, but what they inspired. And it doesn't stop there. Some modern feminist thinkers now use the Agoge as a counterexample to Eurocentric feminism. Because let's be honest, not all empowerment looks the same everywhere. In Europe and the US, feminism has often focused on access, voting rights, education, breaking glass ceilings. But in Dahomey, power meant something different. It meant survival. It meant discipline. It meant standing in the front line, staring down a gun barrel, and refusing to move. And guess what? That's just as valid. In fact, it's necessary to include stories like the Agoge when we talk about women's history. Because not every woman's fight is about boardrooms and corporate ladders. Some are about defending villages, protecting borders, defying empires. That's what the Dahomey Amazons did, and they did it on their terms. So where does this all leave us? It leaves us with a story that is still unfolding, because there's still more to discover, more names to remember, more graves to honor, more lessons to learn, and maybe more importantly, it leaves us with a choice to keep telling these stories, loudly, proudly, often, because if we don't, someone else will write the version that suits them, not the truth. We've already seen that once. It took a century to correct. Let's not let it happen again. Now, before you go, ask yourself this. How many other stories like this have been buried? How many forgotten legends are waiting in the shadows of history? Because if the story of the Dahomey Amazons teaches us anything, it's this: power doesn't ask for permission. It writes its name in fire. And even when the empire falls, the echo never fades.